Dawn in Montana, and the strange figure in the wheat field. The Montana Territory in June 1878 was a place of quiet promise at sunrise, when the air was still cool enough to smell of damp earth and last night's dew clinging to the wheat stalks. The sun just breaching the far horizon threw long amber beams over the swaying fields, turning every head of grain into a glinting point of gold. Gideon West rode along the old cattle trail, his mare's hooves thudding a slow rhythm on the packed dirt, raising curls of dust that hung in the motionless morning air. He'd been gone nearly a week, driving a string of mustangs north to a ranch near Helena, and the saddle had worn him sore. His thoughts were already fixed on a simple supper, a tin cup of coffee by the fire, and the comfort of being alone again in the quiet of his small cabin. But when his gaze drifted across the wheat to the east, he saw something that made his hands tighten sharply on the reins. A lone figure moved through the field barefoot, the pale shape of her calves catching in the light. She walked as though each step might give way beneath her, the hem of her dress torn and matted with dried mud, the fabric clinging to her legs. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in tangled ropes down her back, and both of her arms were crossed over her middle as if she were holding herself together. Gideon's instincts, honed by years on the trail, and a quiet code he never broke, told him she didn't belong here, not in that state. There was no house nearby, no reason for her to be out in the open, and certainly no sense in being barefoot on this unforgiving ground. He swung his leg over and dismounted the wheat, whispering against his boots as he stepped off the trail and into the rows. "Mom," he called, his voice low but steady, meant to reach her without spooking her. She stopped, head lifting just enough for their eyes to meet, though hers looked dazed, as if she had been walking for miles without seeing where she was going. For a long second it seemed she might say something, then her knees buckled and she began to crumple. Gideon was at her side in 2 strides, catching her before she hit the dirt. Her skin radiated heat, her body trembling as though from fever or exhaustion, and the state of her torn, blistered feet made it clear she'd been walking far too long. First contact, and the decision to bring her back to the cabin. Gideon crouched there in the wheat with her weight against him, studying the sharp angle of her jaw and the faint, ragged sound of her breathing. Whoever she was, she'd been through more than a hard walk. Her face was smudged with dirt, her lips dry and cracked, and the faint smell of blood rose from her scraped legs. He spoke again, softer this time, as if speaking to a frightened colt. "You need help." Her eyelids fluttered, and for the first time he saw her eyes clearly, a striking green, dulled by fatigue, but still carrying a flicker of sharpness somewhere beneath the haze. She didn't answer his question, didn't even nod, but she didn't resist when he slipped an arm beneath her knees and lifted her. Gideon carried her through the wheat back to where his mare waited on the trail, the horse's ears a pricking at the sight of the stranger. He swung her gently into the saddle, seating her sideways in front of him so he could keep one arm steadying her, then mounted behind. "My name's Gideon West," he said as they started toward the ridge, his voice carrying just enough to reach her over the creak of leather. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice little more than a whisper. "Zadeie. Zadeie Whitlow." They rode the rest of the way in silence, the wind lifting strands of her hair against his chest, the steady sway of the mare's gait lulling her toward sleep. His cabin came into view at the bend of the creek, a small one-room place with a red tin kettle hanging from its hook by the stovepipe. By the time he reined in, she was asleep against him, her head tucked under his chin. Inside, he laid her gently on the cot, set a bucket of cool water by the hearth, and began tending her feet with the same methodical care he'd use for an injured animal. He cleaned each cut, applied salve where the skin had split, and wrapped the worst blisters in strips of clean cloth. When she stirred, he brought her a cup of water and set a pot of thin venison broth on the stove. She watched him with wary eyes, like someone who didn't quite believe she'd found a safe place. The confession about the children left behind. The warmth from the broth seemed to bring some strength back to her, though her voice remained hoarse when she finally spoke again. "You live here alone?" Gideon glanced up from where he was pressing a damp cloth to her brow. "Yeah," he said simply. She nodded as if confirming something to herself, her gaze roaming the cabin's walls as though taking the measure of the man in the space. Then, without warning, the words tumbled out, half to herself, half to him. "I had to go. I didn't have a choice." He didn't press her, just sat beside the cot, hands resting loosely on his knees. Her lip trembled before she bit it hard, the flicker of control nearly breaking. "I left my children." Gideon's breath caught, but he kept his voice level. "Children." She nodded, eyes fixed on some faraway point. "Nathaniel's 8, Nora's 5. I had to leave them behind, to find help." He said if I ran, she broke off, but the look in her eyes told the rest. Their father Gideon asked quietly. "Not a man you can reason with?" She said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not a man who should raise children?" She swallowed, then met his eyes, and he saw then that her exhaustion had edges made of steel. "They're south, near the Gallatin River, a homestead on the bluff. I'm going back for them. I needed to make it to someone who could help." Gideon rose, without hesitation. "You came to the right place." She blinked up at him as if trying to gauge whether he understood what trouble he was inviting. "I'm not afraid of trouble," he said, and there was no bravado in it, just the plain statement of a man stating a fact. "And I don't leave folks behind." She sat up a little, her fingers brushing against his in something like trust. "I don't know why I trust you." Gideon's gaze didn't waver. "You don't have to. Just let me get your children." Her answer came quick, fierce, despite her exhaustion. "I'm going with you, planning the return to Gallatin River." The cabin was quiet after Zadeie's declaration, the kind of quiet that settled between two people who both knew there was no changing the other's mind. Gideon studied her in the lamplight. Her green eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but bright with a determination that no fever could burn out. She had already decided she was going back, and no argument about danger or sense would sway her. He'd known women on the frontier who had endured hard storms that took their homes, sickness that took their children, but something in Zadeie's stance told him she had survived more than weather or illness. She was the kind of person who had walked through a fire and come out with her spine intact. Gideon poured more water into the basin, rinsed his hands, and began thinking in terms of routes and timing. "We leave at dawn," he said finally, and her head-lifted eyes, narrowing in a way that told him she'd been prepared to fight for that answer. "It'll be faster if we ride hard. You'll sit behind me until we get close." She nodded through the faint tightening around her mouth, told him she didn't like the idea being kept from the reins. Gideon didn't press the point. There was no sense wasting words when the trail ahead would demand enough from them both. He stepped outside to check the mare's hooves and oil, the rifle the air cool against his face. the moon lifting over the dark line of pines. Inside, he could hear the faint sound of Zadeie moving about, likely securing the few things she had. When he came back in, she was seated on the cot, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching him as if weighing his measure. He met her gaze without flinching, and whatever she saw there seemed to settle something in her. They slept lightly that night, if it could be called sleep at all. Gideon listening for any sound beyond the walls, Zadeie staring into the dark as if her will alone could keep her children safe until morning. Before the first grey light crept across the sky, they were mounted. The mare's breath steaming in the cold, her hooves striking sparks from the frost-hardened ground. Zadeie sat close behind Gideon, her arms wrapped around his waist, the warmth of her breath a constant presence against his back. They didn't speak much. The rhythm of the ride was its own language. By the time the sun climbed over the ridge, they were miles down the trail, the open land rolling out before them like a promise they intended to keep, approaching the house of the violent man. The journey south toward the Gallatin River stretched long and tense, the hours marked only by the sound of hooves and the occasional call of a hawk circling high above. By late afternoon, the land began to change the fields, giving way to scrub and pine, the air heavy with the scent of river water and damp earth. Zadeie's grip around Gideon's waist tightened slightly as the bluff came into sight. From the cover of a clump of pines they had a clear view of the homestead below a weathered house with a gray shingled roof and a sagging porch, its boards warped with years of neglect. On that porch stood a man, bottle in hand, swaying slightly as he yelled toward someone inside. His voice carried on the still air, rough and ugly even at a distance. Gideon didn't need to hear the words to know the type. He'd met men like this before, men who believed cruelty was strength and fear was respect. A small shape appeared at one of the windows, pale face framed by hair the same color as Zadeie's. The boy peeked out eyes, scanning the yard before ducking quickly out of sight. Beside him, Zadeie went rigid. "That's Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice fraying at the edges. Gideon's hand brushed hers, a silent anchor. "We'll get them out," he said, his voice steady as stone. How she breathed the word barely more than air. "Wait for nightfall," he told her. "Then I go in. You stay here." She shook her head almost violently. "I'm not letting you go alone." Gideon turned to look at her, his face shadowed in the dimming light. "If he sees you, he might. I would rather die than leave them again." She cut in, her eyes fierce in the fading sun. Gideon studied her for a long moment, then gave a short, decisive nod. All right. They sat in the deepening dusk, the house below them glowing faintly with lamplight, the sound of the man's voice rising and falling like the growl of some half-starved animal. Gideon's jaw was set, his mind already moving through the angles, the distances, the weight of the rifle at his side. Zadeie's hand rested briefly on his arm, the touch light but unshakable. The sun slipped behind the ridge and the waiting began. The rescue in the dark and the confrontation. When full dark finally wrapped the bluff, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke and sour liquor from the house. Gideon moved first, his steps silent through the pine needles, Zadeie close behind, despite his earlier warning. Circling around to the back, they paused beneath a narrow window. Zadeie tapped lightly on the glass 3 quick raps. For a moment, nothing moved inside. Then a small round face appeared, eyes wide and shining in the dim lamplight. Nora. Zadeie pressed a finger to her lips, her hand trembling just once before she pointed toward the back door. The girl vanished, and within a minute the door creaked open. Nathaniel stood there, his small hand gripping his sister's, his expression a mix of relief and fear. "Mama," he whispered, and Zadeie dropped to her knees, pulling both children into her arms, pressing her face into their hair. The moment was short-lived. A shout split the night raw, slurred and furious. The father. He stumbled from the front of the house, the bottle gone a shotgun in his hands. "Run!" Gideon barked, stepping forward, placing himself between the family and the threat. The man leveled the gun, but Gideon was already moving a solid blur in the darkness. He slammed into him shoulder first, the shotgun spinning out of the man's grasp. They hit the ground hard, fists flying, the smell of sweat and whiskey sharp in the cold air. Zadeie pulled the children back, shielding them with her own body, her eyes locked on the fight. Gideon caught the man's arm twisted and drove a fist into his jaw. The crack of impact echoed off the bluff. The man went down hard and didn't get back up. Gideon rose, breathing hard, scanning the shadows for any other danger. "Come on," he said, scooping Nora up and gripping Nathaniel's hand. They mounted quickly, the mare surging forward into the dark, leaving the bluff and its poison behind. No one spoke on the ride back. The only sounds were the steady hoofbeats and the soft, hiccuping breaths of the children pressed against their mother. By the time the first gray of dawn touched the sky, they were at the cabin again. Gideon helped Zadeie down her legs unsteady, and the way she clung to her children told him everything he needed to know. This was not a rescue she would ever forget. The first day safe at the cabin, morning came slow and pale, a thin mist clinging to the low ground near the creek. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, Zadeie's children slept without jerking awake at the sound of footsteps or voices. Nora had already taken to the small clearing as though it were her own, chasing the hens that had wandered too close to the lean-to, where Gideon kept his firewood. Her bare feet pattered across the packed dirt, the hem of her dress kicking up dust as she swung a pine branch to herd the birds away. From the porch, Zadeie stood with one hand holding a shawl close to her eyes, tracking her daughter's every movement, a quiet mix of relief and disbelief on her face. Inside the cabin, Nathaniel sat at the table, shoulders hunched and jaw set as he worked the small piece of wood Gideon had given him. His hands moved slowly but deliberately, pulling the blade toward him in careful strokes, the way Gideon had shown him only once. The boy hadn't needed reminding. Gideon, moving at the stove with a cast-iron pan and a knife, kept one ear on the scrape of wood against blade. When Zadeie came inside, she let the door fall shut behind her with a muted thump. "He's careful," she said, nodding toward her son. Gideon glanced up, his expression a small nod of approval. "He's got a good head." She stepped to the table, resting a hand on Nathaniel's hair, her fingers brushing the curls at his nape. He leaned into her touch, though his eyes never left the wood in his hands. He didn't say a word. "The first week we were gone," she murmured. Just held Nora's hand and kept walking. Gideon flipped the potatoes in the pan, the scent of browning edges filling the cabin. "Hard things leave marks," he said, "even when they don't show right away." Zadeie took a seat near the window, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been thinking about the land behind the creek. The soil's darker. There might be good for squash or corn if we clear the brush." Gideon raised an eyebrow over his shoulder. "You planning a garden?" "I am," she said, "and a root cellar before the ground freezes. I've lived too long with nothing to show for the seasons. He set the pan aside and nodded once. I'll help with the digging. She gave a faint smile. I didn't ask. His mouth twitched just barely. Didn't say I had to. There was a comfort in the way the words passed between them, plain, unadorned, but anchored in something steady. For the rest of the day, the rhythm of safety began to take root. Gideon mending a fence post, while Zadeie sorted through the small pile of seeds she'd found in her bundle. Nora weaving grass crowns in the shade, and Nathaniel trailing after Gideon, quiet but watchful. The air held no sharp edges here, and for the first time the cabin felt like more than just a shelter. It felt like the beginning of something they might be able to keep. Shared stories and glimpses of the past. As the days lengthened and the early summer heat settled over the clearing, the quiet between Gideon and Zadeie began to shift. It was no longer the brittle silence of strangers, but the easy pauses of two people learning each other's rhythms. One evening, after Nora had curled up on the porch steps with her makeshift doll, and Nathaniel had fallen into a deep sleep by the hearth, Zadeie sat at the small table with a basket of mending in her lap. The lamplight caught in the curve of her cheek, and the line of her hair braided and coiled low. She threaded her needle with practiced ease, glancing up when Gideon, leaning against the doorframe, asked, without preamble, "You were a teacher once, weren't you?" Her brows lifted. "How could you tell? You talk like someone who reads more than she speaks." He said, his tone without judgment. She gave a short, surprised laugh, the sound faint like something she hadn't used in a long while. 4 years. Small schoolhouse near Deer Lodge. She smoothed the fabric in her lap. I missed the quiet between lessons, the way the children would leave drawings on my desk when they thought I wasn't looking. Gideon stepped inside, setting a tin cup on the table. I grew up in Arkansas, Northwest Ozarks, left after the war. His eyes were on the lamplight flickering against the wall, not on her. Didn't have much reason to stay. Zadeie didn't press, just kept stitching, letting the thread pull clean through. My father used to sit outside in the evenings carving whistles from dogwood, told stories about rivers he'd never seen. Gideon glanced toward her hands. "You sound like you carry him with you." She nodded. "More now with the children watching everything I do." For a while, they worked side by side, her stitching, him oiling the rifle by the hearth. The cabin was filled with the soft noises of ordinary life. The click of the needle, the slow scrape of cloth over metal, the occasional sigh from the sleeping children. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the air shifted just enough to let in the cool scent of the creek. When she finally set the mending aside, Zadeie looked over at him, her expression thoughtful. "You don't say much unless you mean it. Do you?" He met her gaze and shrugged lightly. "No use saying things twice when once will do the job." Something eased in her posture, a faint lowering of her shoulders, as if some small weight had lifted. It was a quiet exchange, but in that moment they stepped a little closer to something neither of them had dared to name, gradually becoming a family. By midsummer, the patterns of life at the cabin had settled into something that felt almost unshakable. The days began with the low murmur of creek water and the sound of Gideon splitting kindling before the sun cleared the ridge. Zadeie would be at the garden rows by then, her skirts brushing against the young bean plants as she tied them to stakes Gideon had carved from alder. Nathaniel often trailed behind his mother carrying a small bucket of weeds she pulled, though he was prone to disappearing into the cottonwoods with a length of twine and some half-formed plan to catch fish. Nora, light-footed and endlessly curious, spent her mornings pattering between the garden and the porch, her apron filling with whatever treasures she'd discovered: smooth quartz stones from the creek bed, bits of pine cone, the occasional feather from a stray hen. Gideon moved among them in the way a man does when his presence has become part of the landscape, hauling water from the well-mending fence rails, stopping to crouch beside Nora when she wanted to show him something small and precious. Evenings were slow and deliberate. Gideon taught Nathaniel how to gauge the weight of a trade using a set of worn iron scales he kept in a tin box. The boy listened intently, repeating back his mother's words about fairness not being something you stumble into, but something you name out loud when the moment calls for it. Zadeie would sew in the fading light, her needle moving in and out of cloth, while she listened to their voices, a half-smile tugging at her mouth. Sometimes she'd catch Gideon watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze steady and unreadable, though the warmth in it was something she could feel across the room. It was in these unremarkable hours, the shared chores, the unhurried meals, the small exchanges that didn't need explaining, that the three of them began to move as though they'd always been under the same roof. No one spoke the word of family aloud, but it was there in the way Nathaniel followed Gideon's instructions without hesitation, in the way Nora clambered into his lap without asking, and in the way Zadeie's shoulders lowered a fraction each day, as if she were finally breathing in a place that wouldn't collapse beneath her. The first admission of love. The change came one evening after a long day's ride into Willow Bend. They'd gone to trade smoked venison and pickled beans for flour cloth, and a few jars of molasses, with Nathaniel riding in the wagon bed and Nora humming to herself beside him. The trip had been uneventful, but something in the air between Gideon and Zadeie on the way back felt different, heavier, quieter, like the pause before a word you aren't sure you're ready to say. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had gone the color of pewter, the wind carrying the scent of rain from somewhere far off. Gideon bolted the door, while Zadeie stowed the sacks on the shelves, their movements wordless, but in step. The children settled quickly into sleep, and the quiet that followed was not the empty kind. It was full thick with all the unsaid things that had been growing between them since the day in the wheat field. Zadeie straightened from the shelf, turning to face him, her expression steady but edged with something vulnerable. "You've made this place something I could build into," she said. Gideon shook his head. "You've built it just as much." She stepped closer, her voice low, almost cautious. "I don't want to wonder anymore where I stand." His eyes held hers, unblinking. "You don't have to." The space between them closed in a way that felt inevitable, the slow convergence of two people who had been moving toward each other all along. When his lips met hers, there was no rush, no fire meant to burn itself out. It was the kind of kiss that anchored, that settled deep. Her fingers curled lightly into the front of his shirt, and when they pulled back, their foreheads stayed together, breaths mingling. "I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe again," she whispered. "You're safe here," he said simply. "And so are they." She didn't answer, but her hand found his fingers lacing with the quiet certainty of a choice made. The fire cracked low, the shadows shifting against the walls, and in that moment they both knew they had crossed into something they couldn't name, but wouldn't walk back from. News of new life and the proposal. The first hints came quietly, subtle changes in the way Zadeie moved, the way she paused at the garden rose, with her hand pressed low against her back. Gideon noticed before she said anything, but he didn't press. He simply found himself glancing her way more often, his gaze lingering when she bent to draw water from the bucket, or stood a moment too long by the hearth. One evening, with the air cooling into the soft blue of late summer, she mentioned it without ceremony. "My back's been aching different," she said, eyes steady on him. "I've done this before." It took Gideon a heartbeat to understand, then another to set down the tool in his hands. He crossed the space between them slowly, like a man afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. "You're sure I'm late?" she said simply. There was no fear in her voice, only a kind of measured certainty. Gideon reached for her hand, folding it into both of his. "You're not doing it alone this time." Her lips curved faintly. "I know." Later, when the children had gone quiet, they sat together on the porch steps. The moon rose pale and full over the clearing, spilling silver light across the grass. Gideon turned something over in his pocket, his thumb tracing the familiar curve of it. "I never pictured this kind of life," he said, finally, his voice low. "Didn't think I'd earn it." "You didn't earn it," she told him. "You made it." He looked at her, then the words settling in his chest like something permanent. He reached into his pocket and brought out a small silver ring worn smooth by years of being carried but never given. "My mother's," he said quietly. "Meant to give it to someone who'd understand the shape of quiet things." Zadeie stared at the ring, then at him. "You asking I am." She took it from his palm and slid it onto her finger without hesitation. "Then I'm saying yes." Gideon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You want the children to take my name. They already look to you like they belong." The simple truth of it hung between them as steady as the moonlight on the porch. A plain wedding under the cottonwoods. The wedding came a week later, without fuss or spectacle, just the way both of them preferred. The cottonwoods along the creek still held their last yellow leaves, which fluttered down in slow spirals, as if blessing the ground they stood on. The preacher from Willow Bend rode out in the early light, his Bible bound in cracked leather, his hands trembling more from age than the cool wind. Nathaniel stood straight-backed at Gideon's side, his face solemn, while Nora clung to the folds of Zadeie's dress, clutching a bouquet of river grass and late asters she had gathered herself. There were no crowds, no music, just the four of them, the preacher's voice and the sound of the creek moving steady behind them. The vows were plain, each word chosen for truth rather than poetry. When the preacher asked if Gideon would care for Zadeie and all she brought with her, he answered without pause, "Every day I'm given." When it was her turn, Zadeie's voice didn't waver. "I already do." The amen was quiet but final, and then Gideon leaned down to kiss her, a gesture both deliberate and unhurried. They shared bread and venison at the table, afterward cider poured into tin cups. Nora climbed into Gideon's lap, resting her head against his chest, as if it had always been her place, while Nathaniel sat close by, carving a small notch into a stick and occasionally glancing up at the man who was now his stepfather. That night, when the fire had burned low and the cabin was wrapped in stillness, Zadeie turned to him in the dark. "I never thought I'd find peace again." Gideon's reply came without hesitation. "You didn't find it. You built it same as everything else here." She reached for his hand beneath the quilt, their fingers interlacing in the quiet. "Tell me something true," she whispered. He kissed her temple, his voice close and certain. "You're my home." Outside, the creek kept moving. The leaves shifted in the wind, and the cabin, small as it was, felt more like the center of the world than either had thought possible. Winter preparations and the making of the cradle. Winter came down from the high country like a living thing, first in the smell of cold in the air, then in the thin silver glaze of frost that clung to the cabin roof each morning. By late November, snow lay in clean drifts along the fence line, muffling the sound of boots and hooves alike. Gideon rose early, splitting kindling in the gray light while his breath plumed white in front of him. Inside, Zadeie moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had done the work of keeping a home warm through hard winters before. She hung blankets over the doors to keep the drafts out, checked the root cellar, and kept the fire banked just high enough to draw a steady heat. As her belly rounded, she carried herself with a new kind of care, slower but not fragile. Gideon watched her with a quiet protectiveness that showed itself in small ways, bringing the water bucket in himself before she could reach for it, mending the latch on the pantry door without being asked, adding a fresh layer of hay in the lean-to for the mare. In the evenings, he took to working by the fire on something he hadn't done in years: wood carving. The sound of the draw knife against the grain was low, and even the shavings curling to the floor like pale ribbons. Nora sat beside him most nights, her small hands cupping nails as if they were precious coins, while Nathaniel fetched sandpaper from the shelf without needing to be told. Piece by piece, the shape of a cradle began to emerge from the pine boards: smooth rails, rounded corners, a base that rocked with a soft creak. Gideon ran his hands over it often, testing for splinters, sanding until the wood felt warm beneath his palm. Zadeie would glance over from her sewing, her gaze lingering just a little longer, each time the corners of her mouth softening. One night, when he set the finished cradle beside the hearth, she laid her hand against the rail and said simply, "It's steady." He didn't say it aloud, but the thought that came to him was this: so are we. The birth of Clara's spring came slow that year, the thaw running in rivulets down from the hills, swelling the creek until it ran fast and brown. The day Clara was born began before dawn, with a soft wind stirring the cottonwoods and a hush over the clearing that felt almost expectant. Gideon woke to the sound of Zadeie's voice calling his name, not in fear, but in that low, urgent tone that leaves no room for delay. He was at her side in a heartbeat, the firelight throwing shifting gold across her face. Nathaniel took Nora outside their boots, crunching in the leftover frost, while inside the cabin, Gideon moved as if each action had already been rehearsed in his mind: water heating on the stove, clean cloths at the ready, his hands steady even as his chest tightened. Hours passed in a blur of work and breath, Zadeie's hand gripping his hard enough to leave a mark. And then, with the first light spilling over the ridge, there was a new sound in the cabin, a thin, fierce cry that cut straight through the quiet. Gideon held his daughter first, his large hands cradling the impossibly small weight of her. His palms trembled, though not from uncertainty. "Clara Zadeie," said her voice ragged but sure. "After my mother." He nodded, lowering the baby into her arms, watching as Nora peered in from the doorway, wide-eyed and careful. Nathaniel came next, standing tall, but leaning forward just enough to see the tiny face. Later, when Clara slept wrapped in the same quilt that had once been Nora's, The cabin felt full in a way timber and stone could never account for. Gideon stepped onto the porch with her tucked against his chest, the rise and fall of her breath sinking with his own. Zadeie joined him, her hair braided down her back, one hand finding his arm. "We've come a long way," she murmured. He looked out over the greening land, the smell of wet earth and new life in the air. "We'll go farther still." Behind them lay everything they had endured, still part of them, but no longer pressing them down. Ahead was the wide-open stretch of seasons yet to come, and for the first time the weight in Gideon's chest wasn't caution. It was hope, a home, and a future wide open. The first true spring after Clara's birth unfurled itself slowly as if the land were in no hurry to shake off the memory of winter. The grass came in soft and green along the creek's edge, rippling in the wind like a living sea, while the cottonwoods stood just shy of full leaf, their buds swelling in the warming air. Morning sunlight lay long and gold across the clearing, catching in the damp earth and the wooden rail of the porch. Gideon stood there with Clara against his chest, her tiny hand curled into the fabric of his shirt, her breath a warm, steady rise and fall. She was heavier now, more alert her eyes, following the play of light on the trees, as if she already knew this place was hers. Inside the cabin, the low sounds of movement told him the others were awake. Nathaniel rummaging for his carving knife, Nora talking to her doll in a sing-song voice, while Zadeie moved about with the calm efficiency of someone who had turned a cabin into a living heart. She stepped onto the porch a moment later, hair braided neat down her back, sleeves rolled above her elbows. Her palm found the bend of his arm as naturally as if it had always been there. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice warm, but carrying the weight of all it meant, the wheat field where they met the bluff, where danger had waited the long winter nights with the fire banked low. Gideon's gaze followed the sweep of the land, the bright thread of the creek cutting through it, the garden already tilled and ready for planting. "We'll go farther still," he answered. Behind them lay a past that would never disappear, but had lost its hold, softened by the steady work of living. The fear that had once driven Zadeie's steps had given way to a rootedness she hadn't thought possible, her days no longer measured by escape, but by what could be built. Nathaniel emerged from the doorway with a strip of wood in hand, holding it up for Gideon's approval. Nora followed with her apron sagging from the weight of river stones she'd collected. They tumbled down the steps into the yard, their laughter ringing sharp and bright against the quiet hum of the creek. Gideon shifted Clara into the crook of one arm so his other hand could lace with Zadeie's. She leaned into him, her head tilting just enough to rest against his shoulder, and together they watched the wind move across their piece of the world. They had made something here, something that could stand through storms and winters, through the slow, sure turning of seasons. It wasn't just a roof over their heads. It was a life steady and whole, threaded through with trust and the unspoken vow to keep choosing each other. Whatever lay ahead, flood or drought, hard years or easy ones, they would meet it the way they met everything now, side by side. The land stretched out before them wide open, and for the first time neither of them looked at it and saw the distance to be crossed. They saw home. Years later, when the children were taller and the cabin had grown with them, an extra room built onto the side, the garden widened to twice its original rows. Gideon still rose before the sun. The air would be cool and damp, the kind that carried the scent of earth turning towards spring. He'd stand on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the thin curl of smoke from the chimney rise into the pale morning, listening to the soft, familiar sounds of life inside Nora, humming as she helped Zadeie knead bread, Nathaniel splitting kindling without being told, Clara's small voice asking endless questions that only half needed answering. The years had settled over them not as weight, but as a quilt stitched from work, and laughter patched where it had worn thin always enough to keep them warm. They'd seen harsh winters and dry summers, had lost crops to frost, and nursed each other through sickness. But no trouble had been bigger than the ground they'd built their lives on. That ground had been chosen, not stumbled into. It had been claimed with calloused hands and the quiet, unshakable promise to stand together. On mornings like this, Gideon would glance toward the far edge of the field, where once he'd seen a woman walking barefoot through the wheat. Her arms wrapped around herself like she was the only thing keeping herself from falling apart. He could still see her as she was then, but now that memory stood beside the woman who moved through his home with ease and certainty, who laughed more than she used to, and no longer flinched at shadows. Sometimes, when the day's work was done and the sky burned orange behind the ridge, they would stand together on the porch, with their shoulders touching, watching the children in the yard. They wouldn't speak much. They didn't have to. The life they had was not loud or grand, but it was theirs, shaped by their own hands, guarded by their own resolve. And in those long, quiet moments, with the wind moving through the cottonwoods and the smell of turned soil in the air, Gideon would think the same thought he'd had the first morning after bringing her here. I don't leave folks behind. The difference now was that neither did she. Whatever road lay ahead, they would walk it together, carrying what they'd made through every season, knowing that home wasn't a place they had found, it was the life they had chosen and kept side by side.